Hi, Mike. Good evening. Maybe I need to move it from under my shirt. How's that? Better? Better? What's that?
Hi, Jack.
Say hi, Jack.
Yeah, my husband's out home. We have tuned
Oh.
in the past 2 weeks.
Wow.
Hi, Jack.
Hi, Jack. How you doing?
Jen, how's your wife?
She's doing really well, actually. I don't know about this next Sunday, but I'll be able to come for sure. But yeah, she's in her second week, and she's got that little knee scooter thing, and she's scooting around the house, and we figured out a way to shower, and yeah, she's doing she's doing good. I'm excited for how well she's doing. Yeah. She what? Oh yeah, we tried it for about 5 minutes.
I'm really curious about that.
She almost fell over twice. I packaged it up. We're sending that back. No.
That's terrible.
No.
You have any balance issues, you'd be done.
Yeah. No.
But it'd be fun to try.
Don't need a.
Pirate for Halloween.
Yeah. I mean, I think I could do it, but maybe not. But anyway, yeah. I watched a little video. I mean, people are scooting around. Obviously, they have a little practice with it.
Well, but having 2 good feet would also help, and then you don't
Yeah.
need it if you have 2 good feet.
Exactly. So how's school going?
Good.
The
We had state testing today.
oh, really? Already?
Yeah, everybody tested right back because we didn't do it in the spring. Yeah, no. 8th graders took 7th grade test.
Oh.
Everybody was.
What do you do when you find out that half of them don't pass?
They said they're not going to tell us the results, so it didn't hurt anyone's feelings.
Oh my
I
gosh.
said, you have got to be kidding. How am I going to know anything from this data? This is a waste of time.
America.
What have you got there?
Well, are we about ready? I want to play a song.
The other one that cuts up there.
Yeah, we can play it early if you want.
Bye, Shayla.
Bye. Yeah, I got here about 15 minutes early, and she's been going. Like,
Ready to go.
as soon as I got here, I want to go.
Thank you, Shayla.
Goodbye, good
Everything
night.
was dependent on when Mike got here. So.
Okay, we are going to start tonight with something that will probably be uncomfortable for some of you. So I'm going to have you all stand up, and we're going to listen to a song, and it's okay if you want to dance. That's what they did in the Old Testament, for sure. So this is a song I heard recently. I love it, and so I'm like, okay, we're going to play this song.
There's an echo.
Is there?
It's always delayed on the video. Okay.
Oh, it is? Oh,
Somebody's playing it over.
I'll turn my thing.
No, it's in the main.
You missed it. You're going to have to do it all by yourself from have to end. All right, so we'll pray here. Lord, thank you for today, for this time, and just everything that you give us, Father. Every day there's joy, no matter what the circumstance, because you have us in the palm of your hand. We love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to read through your stuff. So I'm hoping to call on you tonight and get your thoughts and opinions. And there's a lot of reading, so we're not going to read through the whole thing. I'm just going to highlight some of the sections. So if you have your Bibles, open up to 1 Kings chapter 3. So we're on our third week here, and we're really starting to get into Solomon's life. And last time we read about the kind of the transition with David, and David, if you would, calling for the anointment of Solomon to be king. And we read through that. Now we've skipped over a little bit, and we're looking at Solomon. And chapter 1 starts with a summary. So some of this, when you read this, you're like, what the heck's going on? This is not all in sequential time. And so sometimes the Bible doesn't do that. So the first verse, for example, says, Solomon made an alliance with the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building the palace and the temple of the Lord. Well, that sentence right there is about 12 or 13 years. So here they've just summarized kind of that Solomon got married. He did, who he married, and that he built a palace and the temple, and then his palace. In fact, he built them in opposite order. He built the temple first and the palace second. And then he's going to jump right into, okay, let's go back and go into some of the details. So that's if you get a little confused with the timeline there. So we're going to we'll start really in verse 2 here. It says, the people, however, were still sacrificing in the high places. So obviously before the temple was built, because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. So who knows what the high places are? You'll read this a lot in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. Anybody have a guess? What are the high places? What does it mean when he refers to the high places? Yeah, high place. And so throughout the other nations, they would kind of, get as close to God that whoever their God was above, and so they would go on a mountain or a high place, and they would make an altar, and that's where they would do their sacrifice or their worship or something like that. And here we see kind of an example of it, but as you study further and you read through Kings and Chronicles, as the kings go on before the dispersion of the nation, there's more and more of this high places. So it's an interesting word, and I think it's one of your questions. The first question is, what's the significance of the word except? But I wanted you to understand what the high places were. So the high places were places where people would go and worship God. Well, what's wrong with that? There must be something wrong, because it says that Solomon showed his love to the Lord by walking according to his statutes, right? He followed God, in other words, except he did this thing. So what's wrong with offering sacrifices up on the mountain? And the issue is in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 12 or so, God specifically tells the nation of Israel, the Israelites, don't worship on all the high places wherever you want to. I will tell you where you will worship, and only there will you worship. And so, and where was that place that they should worship? And we'll see this in a couple of verses here where that was. So we see that Solomon was going up to, we'll call it one of the probably many in the country, a mountain or a high place or a hill or something, and he was going up to Capitol Forest and doing an offering there. So with that in mind, then what would be the problem with the first question with the word except? What does that tell us? So Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt offerings on the high places. Yeah, it's disobedience. It's maybe a little strong because it implies that he's intentionally doing it. It's probably more not knowing or not. It reminds me a little bit of Saul. Remember when Saul would do something and then God would get angry with him? And like Saul, God said, hey, go into this thing and kill everybody. And then they decided, well, we kill everybody but the king. And we took the spoils and you didn't say, well, I did everything you said. And he said, no, you didn't. Where's Nathan? Or would say, well, I think it was Samuel. Well, how come I hear the king's voice? And so this aspect of following God is following everything that God says. Everything to the letter, right? Everything to the detail. And that's something, it's interesting because we'll see as we kind of read through this, that from God's perspective, David did that. Really? What? And so what's the difference here? Because he's pointing out something that Solomon did not do, which is interesting. So where should Solomon have worship? We see this in the next verse. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. How do we know that that was the right place? So first he goes and offers these sacrifices at this high place. Nothing happens. Then he goes to Gibeon, where happens to be the altar and the tent of meeting. He goes there, and after he does that, it says, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God asked him, God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. So very interesting, these two sacrifices, and they're both recorded. In one we see God responding, and one we see God not responding. And the difference isn't the sacrifice. The difference is the obedience of the very specific location that God, this is approved and this is not approved. So, not to bother everybody. So one of the things we want to think about is, or we should ask, why is that significant to record it in the Bible? And in the context of what's going on, because the first verse kind of tells us what we're going to read about in the next few chapters is a building of a temple and a palace. And so what we read earlier, that why did Solomon and why did David anoint last week Solomon king now, is because David wanted to build a temple to the Lord, and God said, that's great, and I love that your heart wants it, but you're not the guy to do it. Your son Solomon's going to do it. And so, God had also said, hey, I've been your God for, say 400 years, but a long time, thousands of years, and I've never asked you to build a temple. So now God is allowing them to build a temple. And it's something significant. This is a very big change in their relationship with God, or God's relationship with them. And so as we read through this, we want to keep that in our mind. What's going on that God is okay with a temple when he never was before? And there's not a temple there today, right? So there's something unique about the situation of circumstances that God was allowing this. And so we were, in a big picture, thinking about what is it that God's revealing. And then part of that revelation is these two verses point out that there are some specifics that God is okay with and that God is not okay with. And there's an expectation that they will follow exactly what it is. And in doing that, they will be, whatever God's intention is of having a temple be built in his honor, that will help to communicate his intent or message that he wants to communicate to them, to us, and to the nations around it. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think we're going to, let me read two more verses, and then I'm going to ask you for your responses to some of the questions. So the king went up in verse 4 to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Solomon said, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright. You have continued this great kindness to me, and have given him a son to sit on his throne on this very day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? And the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that if in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. And Solomon awoke, and he realized that it had been a dream. Okay, so we got a bunch of questions here. We'll start with, how did God communicate to Solomon? And why do you think God made an offer to give him anything he wanted? Yeah, he talked to him in a dream, right? God, and there's a lot of times in the Bible, both Old and New, where God communicates to someone in a dream, and sometimes God communicates to someone, I'll call it in their mind, sometimes audibly, and sometimes in a vision. So this wasn't like this wasn't a dream like you and I dreaming. This was an event while he was asleep, a dream, but it was a real experience that happened. So this was a way that God was going to communicate with him, and we'll see later that God will, and I think maybe next week, the second time that God communicates directly with Solomon. So it kind of sounds like a little bit of a genie, right? The genie lamp, you rub the lamp, and hey, what do you want me? I'll give you whatever you ask for. But that's basically what he's asking. He's offering to Solomon, ask me, and I'll give you whatever you ask for.
So were you saying it was more like a vision?
It was what?
More like a vision than a dream?
No, it was a dream, but I would say it was a kind of a vision while you're dreaming, while you're sleeping, yes.
How would you know the difference? You know?
I'm not sure, because it's not happened to me.
Doesn't it say that then Solomon awoke and he realized it had been a dream? And I felt like he kind of was like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But then he went and later on, and there was the wives and the baby, and then like I feel like he realized, oh wait, God really did give me wisdom in that
He did.
dream.
Yeah, I think what happens in the Bible when we read people who have had these is that when they awake, they always know that what happened was a real event, and that God used their sleep time to communicate with them. And they often will describe what was said and what was heard. So how do they know the difference? I don't know. Maybe the reality of the event or the intensity of the memory or something. But
Well, and I think in even people expect it. You know, because I've read about people who are Muslims and became Christians and said, and I had the dream, and Jesus spoke to me, and so
it happens.
and I think
Yeah.
they expect it more than we do.
Maybe, but it's a recorded event, and it happened. So he had to have communicated this experience to someone who recorded it, the Book of Solomon, and wrote it down. And then we see the evidence that God is this promise and this what he asked for, and then what happened. So that made it evident that what he said happened actually happened. Okay, so it's kind of interesting that God had asked him. Why do you think God asked him? If you would, an open-ended question, ask me for whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. Or what does that express about God, or what does that express about Solomon?
It kind of feels like it's a test to see if he's greedy or if he wants personal growth more than sister growth.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. God knows everything, right? He knows the outcome, but we have a part in it. We're responsible, and you get a sense that this is a test. And God is, number one, kind of testing his heart, but he's also using the circumstance to reveal the heart of Solomon at that time. And has God done this in the past? Yeah, he's done that in the past. We think of Abraham, right? And Abraham believed God, and then he says, Abraham, take your son Isaac. And so, God does, when that happened, God said, hey, through this test, I know that... Boy, I drank a lot, too, before I started. I know that, that this proves your heart or your attitude. So the testing is definitely part of what's going on, to test what was happening. And so let me think here. What does Solomon ask for? Okay, so Solomon's request isn't something simple like, give me X, Lord, I want to win the Mega Millions this weekend. It's not something, or kill my enemies, or it's something, it's a broader. So it begins by first Solomon in his request, he's appealing to God. Even though God says, give me whatever you want, he appeals to him, right? In verse 6. And what's his appeal based on? His father. Show me, you have shown, he's reminding this, and this is something that we see throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament when people approach God. And that often when God approaches people who have forgotten about him is to remind them about God's experience with them in the past. You're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're the God who delivered us from Egypt and blah. Oh, that's that. Oh, yeah, that God. And so we see him doing this. You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David. So I've seen this experience. I've seen this reality before. And then what is it about David? Why did God show this kindness to David, according to Solomon? Because David was. So it's a conditional. From Solomon's perspective, he noticed some conditions about David that he assumed resulted in God's kindness towards him. Does that make sense? Now we know that God loved David and gave him an unconditional covenant or promise. But it's very interesting. So I looked these words up for you. It says he was faithful. And that word faithful means to conduct oneself according to God's holy standard. He was faithful and he was righteous. And righteous means to be blameless, to have blameless conduct and integrity, right actions and attitude. And then the last one is upright in heart. And upright means to be straight or straightforwardness. This is the only place that word's used in the Bible. David's life pointed to repentance, faith, and knowledge of God as central to his uprightness. So we know of David's failures, but we also know of his successes. We can read about David's heart in the Psalms and his experiences. But here, it's very interesting to me that his son Solomon saw these things in David. And he saw that David was one who conducted himself according to God's holy standards, that he was blameless in his conduct, he had integrity, he did right things, right actions, and he was very straightforward in terms of God being the center of his life and his choices. Even though he failed, God was, if you would, at the center. And David was consistent. So here's Solomon pointing that out, and that was why God was kind to him. And then it says, you continued this kindness to his son. And then verse 7, and just a little point here. Remember earlier that everyone, or even Solomon, would talk about David's God, the God of David. But here we see for the first time that he says to the Lord, my Lord and my God. So there's this aspect of this personalness now between Solomon and God. That's a change in him. Okay, so what's the first thing now in verse 7 and 8 there? What does he say about himself before he asks for anything? What's his self-assessment? I think that's one. How old was Solomon? Did you all try to find that out? Yeah, 2021 is probably how old he was. So he's young, right? And not only is he young, but now he's being put on the throne. He's got a lot of conflict in his family about who should be this king. He's following this king that was unbelievably successful, and by the time that this happened, David was old and wise, if you would, and he's stepping into this, and he's stepping into the responsibility of managing a huge, 1 million people, a large nation. So,
Say something about Solomon too, that he wants to do a good job.
Yeah.
And he understands that I'm 20 years old, I don't know what I'm doing, but I really want to do a good job helping.
Yeah.
And so I admire that, because a lot of those young guys that came into the kingship were like top of his head, and you're thick as my, finger.
Yeah. Maybe it's the next one after Solomon. The next one after Solomon, who's young, and he says, what should I do? And he asks for some advice, and the wise people say, you should be kind to the people and all this. And then his young buddies say, no, let's be harsh, and so it does reveal. This is a test, and we're seeing Solomon's heart being revealed. And part of that revelation is, first, he's acknowledging who God was, and he's acknowledging that I saw your favor in my father David, and what I noticed in my father David was that he was upright, he was righteous, and he was faithful. I noticed those things, and because of those things, you were kind to him, and your kindness to him is now spilling over to me. I'm inheriting that kindness by you putting. So we get a sense that he's very humble, and he's a little bit afraid, and he is very self-aware of his limitations. So I'm young, and who can do this job that you've put me in? He's worried about it. So he's going to ask for something. And we want to just take a moment to really, not dissect, but really pay attention to what he's asking for and what's revealed in his asking. Because it's a little bit different. Remember last week we read his father David gave him some advice. It's a little bit different than that advice. And then we want to watch Solomon's life and see what happened as a result of what God gave him and his motivation for it, and learn from that, because God's recording this for a purpose for us, and there's some good lesson in here. Okay, so then one of the questions, what did Solomon ask for, and what does it express about his priorities? So what did he ask for? Ellie. Yeah, a discerning heart, right? So he wants to be, discernment is to, well, I won't say it. How do you express that? What's discernment mean? When someone has have the ability to discern, what does that mean to you?
I'm reading out of the NIV, and it says understanding.
Okay.
Understanding part.
It's in a situation to have knowledge and be able to make a right choice or understand what is going on here, right? That kind of a subjective nuance.
The phrase indicates the ability to listen patiently to all sides of an issue in order to come to a true and wise decision.
So that's probably an example of what we're going to read, well, if we have time tonight, about the example of his wisdom. But discernment is that ability to take in, understand, and then make a decision that's proper. Balanced, if you would. Okay, so discernment to do what? To govern, right? So when we think about governing, a person who's governing is a person who's making rules and regulations and order in to maintain a civilization or society, right? So he understands that as the king, he has power and responsibility to keep the people healthy, to maintain order, and God uses the word justice, and we won't go into that, but that's a really important word in the Bible, just and justice. And I think I may have told you this before, but in the Bible, about 80% of the time that the word just or justice is, you read it, it's the same word, and it has two meanings. 80% of the time, the meaning is God's expectation that people who have power and authority will protect the rights of those who don't. So Jesus would say, religion is caring for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner. In the Old Testament said, those who don't have the power to represent themselves or to care for themselves, justice is maintaining their rights and their privileges. And so when we read that, and God's talking about a discerning heart to govern, it's that aspect of justice. He has a responsibility to make sure that the society is fair and just towards everyone, including those who are poor, orphan, foreigner, can't care for themselves, don't have a voice, females in that society, etc. It's a high responsibility, right? And he's obviously has enough understanding to comprehend this job, because he's going to ask for help to do it. The fact that he even recognizes that he needs help, if you read further, everyone that follows him doesn't recognize that necessarily. They don't ask for that kind of help. Okay, and so keep going. Then what does he ask for next? He wants to distinguish, right from wrong, right? So his heart is that God would give him a discerning heart so that he could distinguish, to govern the people and distinguish right and wrong. How is that different from what David recommended he do? Let's see here. Yes, I'm trying to find the words discernment are actually, it's a, shoot, I should have wrote it down. It's almost an exact phrase that David told Solomon to do. Discernment and understanding are the words, shoot, I have to go find it. I'll just tell you the difference. So when David tells Solomon, seek knowledge and wisdom, or discernment and understanding, when he tells him that, he says, so that you will follow the Lord in all his ways. But Solomon's asking for discernment so that he can do his job well, so that he can govern, right? So that he can govern and know right and wrong, because he's got this huge responsibility. Are they different? Or is one bad or good? Well, God was, as we just read, God was pleased that he asked for this, right? He was pleased that he asked for it. So it's a good thing you're asking for it. But they're subtly different. And so when we think about their two lives, we want to just kind of hold on to those differences and watch what happens with Solomon's life and what happened with David's life, so we can compare them to see, are they really different or are they the same? And if they are different, what's the difference and what's the impact of that difference? So it's not a bad thing that Solomon's asking for. In fact, God said it's a good thing. God was pleased that he asked for this. And so this was a test of his heart and his attitude. And obviously Solomon had a heart that knew his limitations, knew the responsibility before him, knew that he couldn't do it by himself, and was asking God for help. Makes sense to me. And that he was now calling God or Lord his God, his Lord. So these are a lot of significant changes. And then what do we see? What was God's reply? One of the questions for you was, God replies to Solomon with an unconditional and a conditional pledge. So what's the unconditional pledge? Yep. Keep going.
And yeah, he gets wealth, honor, and then the conditional is, the conditional is if he's obedient, then he gets to live long.
Right. So in that we see God is saying, ask me for whatever you want. We see this revelation of his attitude, and God says, because I'm pleased that you asked for this, and because you did, I'm going to give you what you asked for. I'm going to give you not only a discerning heart, I'm going to make you the wisest person that ever lived, actually. No person has ever been as wise or understanding, and no one will ever be. That's pretty incredible, right? And in addition, I'm going to give you the things that you didn't ask for. I'm going to make you wealthy and famous like no one has ever been. So is God a God of his word? I mean, as we read through Solomon's life, we want to see if that really happened. Did God do that or not? And we're going to see it revealed that God did do that. But then we also see that there's a conditional clause. So, hey, it's great that you want to care from this responsibility and govern people, and you want justice and all these things that God wants too. And so God's going to help him. He's going to give him discernment and wisdom. But there's also this conditional clause that says if. And listen, what is it? If you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did. So this again, as an example of some of the times when we read conflict within the Bible of, well, David didn't always follow his commands. David didn't always do the right thing. But from God's perspective, he is the standard. And throughout all the rest of the kings, they will always be compared to David. So it's not the failure, it's the heart attitude, it's the motivation. And so this condition is, if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes, if you're obedient, hey, you remember like you made that sacrifice on the high places? That wasn't it. That wasn't being obedient. Obedient was making that sacrifices and following at the right place, in the right way. So an expression of God has, if you would, things for us to do or for him to do, and he has an expectation that Solomon will follow them exactly. That Solomon will be an example to the people of obedience to God and faithfulness to God. If you do, you're going to live a really long life. And implied, if you don't, you won't. Right? So there's this conditional aspect of it as well. And from God's perspective, the one thing I'm going to give you, because you asked for it, fame, you're going to be wealthy, you're going to have more wisdom and understanding than anyone's ever had. But at the same time, I have an expectation that you will be obedient. And if you're not, there's a consequence to that. Okay. So good. Let's see. So then just turn the page there and we'll just highlight this. The first expression was God faithful in doing what he said he's going to do. We see in 1 Kings chapter 3 there, 16 through 28. And we all know this story. The two prostitutes, and they both have babies, like 2 or 3 nights apart. They wake up one morning, one of the babies is dead. And so there's a conflict of whose baby is it or whose baby isn't it. One of the things I want you to notice is that what is one of the jobs of the king in ruling was to judge, right? So, I mean, when you read, this is kind of interesting. These are a couple, if you would, prostitutes, and they have a conflict over whose baby it is, and it goes to the king, not to some other judges or to somebody else. It went to the king. And so this was also understanding when he's asking for discernment to determine and judge right and wrong. It's part of his role as a king to be a judge, to judge right and wrong, and that was part of his governing role. Now we see that that's part of a king's role, and it was part of Jesus' role, and when Jesus comes back and he's sitting on the throne, that will be part of his role. When we read, future events in the Old Testament, it describes him as ruling with an iron rod. And he's going to be sitting on a throne, and that conflicts will come, and he will rule justly and rightly. So we see that here, and you guys know the story, but I think it's interesting that this is an expression to the people of how wise Solomon was. So they come together, and then one says, "This is my son," "No, it's my son," "No, it's my son," and he listens to them, and he can tell. He says in verse 23, the king said, "This one says, 'My son is alive and your son is dead.' While the other one says, 'Your son is dead and mine is alive.'" You can imagine the chaos and the roaring going on before the king. And they're just like yelling back and forth. And so he just quickly decides, "Bring me a sword. I'm going to cut it in half. Each one of you have." And the one mother says, "Don't do that, don't do that. Don't kill my son, let her have it." And the other one says, "Fine, cut him in half." And so he discerns that the one who had a heart for the life of the child must be the mother, and the one that didn't must not be the mother. It kind of sounds pretty simple, really, right? When we look at it, but at the time and event, and a 20 or 21-year-old put in this new position, it's pretty amazing. And this, not only that, but the whole nation's looking at this. Is how is he going to handle this? He's the new king. What's he going to do? And his handling of it is a way that reveals the truth without him having to say the truth. He does it in a way that they express the truth. And then he makes, and so what does it say at the end? When all Israel heard the verdict that the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So one of the things about being successful, and we'll see in Solomon's success as a king, so we saw a rival, right? And that Adoniah, we're not going to go, maybe we do next week, but he had, there was a rival about who should be king. And there was conflict. Some of the officials wanted to go with him, and some didn't, and they stayed with Solomon. And afterwards, the other ones kind of came back over here. So there was some conflict or intrigue. But what we see from this event going forward is that Solomon is trusted by the people and revered, and what he says they do. And we'll see, like he tells them to do some amazing things, and they do it, and there's not conflict. So one of the things, remember, that God had foretold about Solomon was that Solomon would be a king of peace, that there would be rest in the nation and there would be peace, and that during that time of rest and peace, that was when God was going to allow them to build a temple. And so we see the beginning of this, that the nation is going to get behind Solomon, and it's the expression of his wisdom and his justice, that God had given him wisdom to administer justice. And so it's that same justice concept. 80% of the time, and this is one of those that I described what that meant, it's holding up the rights of individuals and people groups, so that the powerful or the mighty don't get to make the rules just because they have wealth or power. The other time, 20% of the time that the word is used, it means to judge rightly, or having to do with like a legal term, where someone like this comes before the court and the judge listens and says, you're guilty, you're not guilty. But most of the time it has to do with the social responsibility kind of an aspect of it. And we see that throughout the Bible, and we'll read it in Proverbs a lot when we go through that. That it says something like God hates an unequal or unbalanced weight. And what people would do is they'd like, I'm going to sell you this for $5 a pound, but the thing they had didn't really weigh a pound, it only weighed a half a pound, so they would get paid more than they should have, etc. And God hates those kinds of things, or people taking advantage of the innocent to gain wealth. And we'll see this aspect over and over again. And we see that God has given him wisdom, and one of the outcomes of that wisdom is that he can administer justice rightly or correctly. Okay, any questions about that? Probably get, dang, we're definitely getting around out of time. Okay, let's jump to 1 Kings chapter 4 real quick, and we'll just highlight this. 4:29. So in verse 29 it says, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding his measures as the sand of the seashore. So it's a good metaphor for this amazing wisdom and understanding that God gave him. I like this in verse 33. Solomon, he described plant life, from the cedar of the Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also taught about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. And I think what an amazing thing that one of the things that I find fascinating about us as human beings is that we don't carry on the knowledge from our ancestors. We got to start all over again. Imagine how much we would know if we could have their experiences, right, and knowledge. There's an old movie, Matrix, if you ever saw that. But in that movie, they can download knowledge. And like when she downloaded, now she's a karate expert or whatever. She downloads, she can fly an airplane. And when I read this, I get that sense, like God downloaded all this knowledge and understanding. He didn't go study it, he knew it. And he was like, hey, you want to know how a plant grows? You put the seed, you want to know, today we'd say, you want to know how DNA works and how the environment, everyone would come to learn and listen for him because no one had ever had this knowledge. He could describe animals and probably anatomy and what made the deer do this and that do that, and how plants grow and where to plant and how to build. And I mean, it's incredible to think about it, that people from all around the known world at that time would come just to listen to him. And so that's the extent of this wisdom. Here's a question that we want to think about is, what does he do with that? God gave him this thing. He asked for it. God gave it to him. Knowledge and understanding, made him the wisest person that ever lived. He's going to give him fame, and wealth. What does he do with it? Because his life is in here for a reason, and I think last week or a week before we talked about key people in the Bible, and the question ultimately is, how do we as human beings get back with God? How do we get back to Eden? How do we get back in right relationship with God? Is it being obedient to the Word? Is it being the most knowledge and most wise and understanding person in the world? Is that the kind of, is it being a great warrior like David and following God and going to defeat all the enemies? Is that how we get back to establishing a right relationship and a right kingdom with God, where God is ruling and where everything's great and rosy and the world is perfect? And so, we saw Moses, Abraham, then we saw Moses, and then we saw David, and now we're seeing Solomon, a different kind of ruler who has, hey, he's now the wisest and most understanding person. He knows justice. He knows right and wrong. We're going to see wealthy and famous. What does he do with that, and what's the outcome of it? Is that what God is doing here, is revealing to us that if we'll seek knowledge and understanding, that we can get to be right with him. We can reestablish or restore the relationship. I'm not going to answer that tonight, but I want you to kind of have that in your head as we read through this, that is one of the things that we want to look at in Solomon's life to find out, is that the answer or not? Does that make sense? So obviously he was really wealthy. Temple. So he's going to build a temple. And it's kind of interesting just highlighting. So the first thing he does is, remember that David has provided him almost everything that he needs. And so Solomon's going to write to the king of Tyre, and he's going to ask him, this was a very heavy forested area, and he's going to ask him for all these cedar logs to build the temple, a lot of them actually. And when he asked for those, it says in verse 7 of chapter 5 here, when Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, "Praise be the Lord God today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation." And so he sent word to Solomon, "I've received your message you sent, and will do all you want in providing the cedar and pine logs." And it goes through, and then he asked for him, if you would, food and oil in exchange. And Solomon he sent him 70,000, what is it here? How much? 125,000 bushels of wheat every year, and 115,000 gallons of olive oil. How much were they growing that he could afford to not only feed everybody, but give that much in exchange? I mean, it boggles my mind. But that's how prosperous things were in Solomon's reign. And how God, when he said, "I'm going to give you rest and peace," the fields, the harvest was great, the rains came, the sun shined. It was really like a great blessing, a great time of prosperity. But I thought this was, when you read this, and maybe I think it's one of the questions, the king says back to Solomon, he says, "Praise be the Lord God today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation." And I think it's, that's good enough. What is the king saying about, what does this sentence say about this king of Tyre, his theology? Praise be, let me get it here. Yes, praise be the Lord. I'm sure it's right in front of me. Oh, here it is. Praise be the Lord today, for he has given David. And there's somewhere else, it's probably in Chronicles, where he talks about this being the God, or the God of Israel, or something like this. So one of the things I want us to think about and realize that contextually is, let me see if I can find it here. Shoot, I should have wrote down some notes for myself. At this time in history, polytheism, many gods, was normal. And so when we read the king of Tyre talking about the nation of Israel, and the king there and talking about God or the God, he's talking about the God of Israel. He's not talking about God as we think about God. Every one of these countries has their own God. And when we read Solomon, and we're reading about Solomon, I don't want you to think that Solomon was not a polytheist. It was David's God, and now it's his God. It's the God of Israel. But other nations have gods. How do I know that? Because one of the things that Solomon says is we're going to build to the people, hopefully you read that, we're going to build a great temple, the greatest temple, so that we can reveal that our God is the greatest God of all the gods. Right? Not the greatest God, the only God, but the greatest God of all the gods. But do you see what it's telling us? It's telling us. Now that's important because that's the reality of the situation that was existing at that time. And that begins to help us, or we should ask the question, is God allowing the nation of Israel to build a temple so that he can differentiate himself from all these other gods? It's hard for us to think about that. I was thinking today, or the other day, about most of the world today is monotheistic. More than 85% of the population in the world believes there is no God, or it's about 85, believes that there is a God. There's only a couple religions that think that there are multiple gods, or polytheistic. But the world has really moved away from that. And actually, this was the beginning. Because if you go back in history and you look at when did they stop having all these gods and start thinking about one God, this was actually the beginning of that. Because one of the things that happened is that they all assumed that, our God, your God, whatever, and that when you defeated that nation, then your God was greater. And then remember when Jesus comes along, and the Greeks had all, this temple of Athena and blah, 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 and all that. But it wasn't shortly after that when that goes away and the world moves to a monotheistic faith-based system. So today we have Christians and Muslims and others, but they all think that there's one God. But that's why I'm pointing out, I don't want you to think that that's what was going on here. Solomon did not think that, and nor did the nations around them. So how does God differentiate himself as a God, as the only God, in the midst of all that? Not only to the nations around them, but to the nation of Israel. He needs to elevate their understanding of who he is, that he's not the God of Israel, which he is. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but ultimately he is God. And he's not one of many. But at this time, polytheism was the norm, and Solomon and the nation of Israel, they were there. And going back to where we started, the high places throughout that land, and remember they kind of conquered a bunch of people as they they had all these temple high places all over the place. And when we read further through Kings, as you study that, you're going to find that Solomon's going to build a temple. The nations, God's going to give direction. That the people all have to come there. This is where you do your sacrifice. This is the whole process. And one of the things that the nation keeps sinning is they keep using all the pagan high places that have been there for years. Instead of tearing them down, they keep using them over and over again. They keep going back to that polytheistic, multiple ways of doing it. And one of the things that God, and we saw very early, that Solomon revealed his heart, accept, right? And this issue of accept is going to be something that the nation will do over and over again. And God's very particular. He's going to give them, I want you to do it this way. You're going to have a temple to do this thing. And the reason for that is to differentiate this God so that they know he is God, and to differentiate him from all these other gods that are surrounding them. So when they conquered a people, they didn't always wipe those people out. And if you read it, how did he begin to build a temple? So he needed some helpers, some workers. What did he do? I think that was one of the questions here. Yep. So he got them. And so you're going to read that he conscripted, right? Remember how many people he conscripted? Yeah, I think it's about 70,000 or more. 30,000 were like cutters, and 40,000 were this, and he did it in a very wise way. So first of all, these weren't slaves. He said to the nation, I need you 30,000 people to go to this, stop doing your job, come do this job. And how often would they work? One work out of 3. They would work a month, and then they'd go home for 2 months. That's pretty smart, It's pretty smart. And yet it was, think how many people that was working and how to feed, all the logistics of how to feed them, and how to get food to them, who was responsible for this, and who's going to organize it, and how to cut it, and how to, it's mind-blowing that he did all this manual labor, and he did it, it took him 7 years, I think, 5 years, 7 years to build the temple. I wrote a number of years, but not the next time they're going to build it, it took him more than 30 years. So he does this amazing feat. I just think of all the information and knowledge, and remember that God had given David the blueprints, and then Solomon finds all these workers and skilled people, and they go to the quarry and they cut out the rock, and they bring the rock. They have to transport these gigantic stones. They bring them and put them in place, and they bring the next one, and it fits. They didn't do a lot of carving on the building site. They did the carving in the quarry. And the same thing with all the other stuff. And then if you read through this, all the detail of all the gold parts of the temple and all the fine pieces and etc. So it's to me, it's incredible what was going on and the expression of God's wisdom to him and understanding that he could do all this. Now, were the other nations of the world watching? How do we know that? Yeah, that's one way. But we just read, remember, that it started out with kind of like, here, let me give you the overview, and then we'll get into the details. The Bible does that a lot. And so one of the things that he had so much wisdom and understanding that the kings from all the world would come just to sit and listen to him, right? So this aspect, and there's one we'll see a specific, so that's happening a lot. So the Bible often will say, well, there's 50 people doing that. Let me pick one person, and we'll give you that story, the Queen of Sheba. And we'll read about that as we go along. So just this sense of the awe and wonder that's going on, and he is probably 20, 21 years old, and when he's finished, it's like he's 25 or 26. He's really a young guy, and this incredible gift that God has given him just is amazing that has happened. Okay, last couple minutes is the next thing he's going to do in 1 Kings 8 there, hopefully you read, is the Ark of the Covenant. So the temple gets built, and he's going to go get the ark. So do you remember what the ark is? Right, this is so God had given Moses, just like he gave to the temple, very specific blueprints or details how to build this ark. And the ark was to carry something very holy. And what did the ark represent? So the 10 Commandments were in there. And what happened if you touched the ark? You died. So that's kind of a weird, was it like a giant taser? No, the ark represented something, right? What does the ark represent? That if you touch it, you die. Let me tell you another time to help you out. There's another time right before that when God gave the 10 Commandments, and he was up on the mountain, and the mountain was shaking, and a black cloud and roaring noise and everything, right? And the Bible tells us if anyone touched the mountain, stepped on the mountain, they died. So the same theme here. What is that theme representing? What's that? The holiness of God. The ark represents God and his holiness, right? And what represents that you can't touch it? Right. The sinfulness of man, right? The unholiness of man versus the holiness of God. So the ark is representing something. And what happened? They went and got the ark. And remember, there's special ways to carry it. These two poles and stuff, and what happens? Then they bring the ark up to the temple, and where do they put it? The Holy of Holies. It's very interesting when you read those things like truly, truly. It's like an expression of being the most or excessive. So this is the most holy, most excessive place on earth that God would be there. Well, how do we know God was there? What happened? What filled it? Yeah. How do you know? Yeah, how do we know? How did they know that God was there with them, the presence? And as soon as they put it there, a cloud, how does it describe that cloud? Yeah, it was a thick, dark cloud that came and settled in the Holy of Holies room. And it was so thick that they couldn't do their work, right? So when we think about what is that telling us? What does it mean they couldn't do their work? Does it mean like they couldn't see what they were doing? Or that they were, well, I'll just say, when I read it, I get a sense that they were no longer allowed to go in there. They knew that if they did, something bad was going to happen, right? And we know that later, that how often, now let me say it this way. This is not new information for them. Remember when God gave the 10 Commandments and the law, and he gave all the rules for the sacrifice, and that the high priest could only go in once a year, and if anybody else did, they would die. So that was hundreds of years before. They have all that knowledge and information. They're just taking this thing and they're putting it in a new place. So as soon as it puts, the cloud of God is not something new. It would go down to the tent of meetings, and when it did, only Moses could go in there. Everyone else stayed away, or boom, they're gone. And so that aspect of when God's holiness settles, we got to get out of here. Just like with Moses and the burning bush. And this theme is played over and over again. And so here is God expressing the temple's been built in the Holy of Holies. My presence is here now. And as soon as that happens, we see that the people, even the priest, have to be separated from God. Is it?
It is, because then you have such a realization that you cannot be there. And without Jesus bridging that gap,
Yeah.
you're going to be forever separate.
We're looking back and seeing that, and that's what the Bible is intended to do. But at the time, did they get that?
No.
Right? So two things are happening. Number one, we have a new king. He's the wisest. He's the smartest person that's ever lived. He has authority. He understands justice, and we're going to see, he's already wealthy. David's given him, he's wealthy beyond, and we're going to see, just in the time to build a temple, like, this guy's amazing. Look what he's accomplishing. Look what and the Bible tells us that they were happy to do the work. This is an amazing time of peace and prosperity, all in this king. Like, wow, we must be right with God. And in the middle of that, there's a temple. God's presence comes, like, we can't get close to God. It's two conflicting concepts. One is God's with us, prosperity, great, we're doing great. And the other thing is God's with us, and whoa, we better watch out. Right? That's should cause them to think a little bit about what's the meaning of all that, and then looking, because we know that all these things, the Bible tells us in the New Testament, that everything in the Old Testament God did and recorded to teach us, to bring us to a place of under. And so if we what is the message in the Old Testament? Is it leading to Jesus? If it is, then there's a message, a reason that leads to Jesus. What is that message?
Maybe it was a way for God to show that he was supreme over every other god.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Yep. He's going to do that. Just from a practical perspective. Exactly. All the other gods, you just go up to them and, rub on them or give me a high five or whatever. Nothing happens. You go into this cloud and boom, you're dead. The bad news travels fast. It wouldn't take very long for the nations around that to understand this. In fact, we read later in the Bible when God starts to discipline Israel for what they've done, the nations mock them because they know that they have been disobedient to God. So the world is getting this. Does that make sense? But there's also this aspect of this God now is present. He's not in a temple. He's not in a statue. There's a cloud. His presence is there, and that he's real. This is a real God. This is something real, and it's dangerous to approach. Right? God is. If he's with us, we're prosperous. Well, what if we're not? What if I'm not obedient to his commands? That conditional aspect. Solomon, I'm going to give you all this, but if you're not obedient, then there's a consequence. And there's another aspect of it that leads to Jesus that we think about, that our actions and our obedience to God have consequences. And those consequences affect our life. So, the consequence isn't that you're going to have a timeout. He says, you may not live long, or you may something, in the Old Testament, even before this, what happened to the disobedient? The ground swallows up 10,000 at one time. There's consequences to this. So, wow. On the one hand, God's there with them. On the other hand, God's there with them. And so, looking back at that time, this is just the beginning of a story for them to begin to understand. Is that wisdom and knowledge and prosperity and goodness that keeps us in right relationship with God? If it was, then why is the cloud unapproachable? Right? And our nature is, I don't want to think about that. I just want to think about this good stuff. And we see that even when Jesus came and the Pharisees, they just want to think about this part of it. It's easy for us to confuse the story. But ultimately, we're going to find in Solomon's life, like other people in the Bible's lives, that having great wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and prosperity, and fame, and fortune, and everything isn't going to make him right with God. It's not going to make him right with God. And ultimately, if the wisest person in the world can't do it, then what hope do I have? And so that's how it begins to point towards Jesus. I need God to do something for me that I can't do for myself, that the wisest person in the world couldn't do, or the most powerful ruler couldn't do, or the guy who walked with God and got the 10 Commandments and went in the tent of meeting, he couldn't do. So if they couldn't do it, then what's my hope? And so this is another part of that story. And the temple worship is a huge part of that message, and we're seeing it kind of literally built through this person, Solomon.
They had their 614 laws by that time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if they had that many by that time. But they had a lot of them, 217, I think, or some number like that, or in the original Pentateuch, and then they added over time, yeah. What's that word? There's a Jewish word for the added, the extra. Gosh, we should know it when watching them. For adding the extra laws that they added on through their interpretations. Okay, sorry, we had a lot to cover tonight, and hopefully you read it. And any comments from your reading or your questions that you'd like to share, or that we didn't cover, or aren't clear? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so did Solomon believe there was multiple gods in all his life?
I don't know what he believed.
Did David think like that too? I just don't get like how he can think that and be so, like if he was the wisest person in the world, and then if David was a man after God's own heart, like
Oh, I love what you're asking.
I
I'm
don't
not going to answer that question directly, but I want you to think about the question, because I've been trying not to. As we look through this, I want us to think about this question. Solomon was the wisest person that ever lived. Wise in what? Wise in what? In what way was Solomon wise?
You don't want us to understand. You don't want us to do.
I don't want you to answer the question. I want you to think about it. And as we go through the course, when we get to Ecclesiastes, we're going to look at that question in detail. He was the wisest person that ever lived. But what was he wise in? And a little bit of forecast is, when we get to Ecclesiastes and we look back at what Solomon asked for at the beginning, there's a little revelation about that. What was he wise in? Because what we're wise in affects what we do and how we do. So did Solomon, I'm just giving you my opinion. This is my disclaimer. This is my opinion. I don't know. We'll find out and go to heaven. Dietrich, you were way off. But there's this kind of a tribal or national sense of people who lived at that time. Just like we're Americans and we have a president and a government, when we think about government and we think about the role of the president and rule and all that, it's very different than a person who lives in China or North Korea or Russia or France. They think of it very differently. So when we use the word democracy and they use the word democracy, they're different words. We say the same word, but they're different. I'll just say there are some religions that claim to be Christian and they use the same words, but they don't mean the same thing. And so when I read this, I get a sense that Solomon and David, for example, fully believed that God, as we know God, and as they knew God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was their God. He was their only God. He was the one God for them. but at the same time, a realization that these other nations around them, they like had their own tribal God. They had their own God. And I suspect personally that David came to know that God was God alone. Because when we read some of the Psalms, we're going to read that in there. But when we read things about Solomon, and that I don't know that he had that understanding at this time. Now, when we get later and read through Ecclesiastes, we're going to see a different attitude. We're going to see a maturing of understanding who God is. But remember, he just went from David's God to my God. And he's going to experience God in his life. And that's going to teach. He's a wise guy. He's going to gain wisdom from this experience and learning who God is. And he's going to come to understand that God is God alone. And that will come with both positive and negative experiences, that understanding. Yeah. But at this time, I don't think he did. I think he had a more temporal worldview based on everything that was around him.
I guess not. It seems like that would be an important part.
Yeah. So when he, okay, so yeah, when I'm not going to answer that right now, but I want us to think about and read, as you're reading, think about what was he wise in, i.e., what was the download? It wasn't everything, it was specific. There was a specific kind of download. You know, he didn't just get martial arts, he got karate and he didn't get taekwondo. It's, when we read the story and think about it, we can go back and like, what did God give him knowledge and wisdom in or about? So we know he gave him knowledge to govern, right? He gave him knowledge about plants and animals. He gave him knowledge to understand good and right and wrong, and to exercise justice, because we've seen that already. So then, you know, he gave him knowledge, obviously, about mathematics and craftsmanship and design, because we've seen that. He's building a temple. So we want to think about the expression of that knowledge and understanding.
This verse just keeps sticking out to me. 4:32, he did all of that. But he also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005.
Right, amazing. Yeah. So what sticks out about that to you?
Wow.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
kidding. How did he do that? And how
He could do all this, but he could also do.
right. Yeah, I mean, unbelievable what he accomplished, and this is just the beginning, but yeah.
Well, and one of your questions was, is it possible to have wisdom without knowledge? And I
Yeah.
think it is.
You do?
I do. Stephen Hawking. He was very knowledgeable, but I don't find him wise.
Who?
Stephen Hawking, that guy in the wheelchair. Yep, I put yes and then I put no, or I put no and then I put yes. It can both be true in different thoughts. Well, the example is, I think a person can be kind but not be thoughtful.
Sure. When I think about, this is just semantics. When I think about wisdom, I think about making a good assessment of circumstances, and to me, you have to understand them in order to make an assessment or discernment about them when I think about wisdom. Because, one of the things you'll see when we get to Proverbs, we'll be looking at words like wisdom and understanding and prudence and integrity, and we're going to find as we get through that a lot of those words are the same word. It's hard to differentiate them. It's like faith and discipline. Those words are the same word in the Bible most of the time. And so they seem different to us, and they are different, but yeah. So I just asked the question because I wanted to see what you think about.
You have to have the knowledge and how, so that if that goes together. But he didn't know absolutely everything and everything that was going to happen.
So a good example to your point is that the two prostitutes, he didn't know who the mom was, or he didn't know that, right? But he knew human nature, and he applied that to create. So yeah, I think it's difficult, and maybe to have one without the other. But you can have knowledge without wisdom. I have seen that a lot. That's for sure. So it depends on kind of what we do with it.
I took that question and I tried to apply it to my life today. What is attainable for me that I could even relate this to? I'm talking about that question specifically. It's like, I don't have to have all the knowledge, or maybe I should, before I make a decision.
Right?
Can I give a very specific example?
Yeah, fire
My
away.
husband wanted to buy a grocery store. We're going to buy this 50-50. However, I have no idea how that grocery store runs. So I, in faith, signed my name with my husband. I still don't know how it runs, but we keep eating. And so I didn't have to understand the whole thing, and I'm not saying that I was or was not wise in signing those.
Yeah.
But how can we know everything?
No.
You know, sometimes you just have to take a step at a time and let it go.
And there's something about having peace with what you just did as well, and not have the turmoil.
Yeah. So, if I want to build a house, I better have some understanding. I may not know everything. If
Like
I want to
important
just,
things, like what color you want to paint the door, right?
yeah.
Yeah, the front door.
But there are other parts of our life where it's more relational or something else. And then we also gain knowledge and wisdom from experience. And I like to say this. We have some teachers in the room here. We learn more from being wrong than we do from being right. And I liked math, so when my kids are growing up, I'd tell them, yeah, Dad, whatever. And I'd say, oh, hey, here's an example. If you ask a kid what 1 + 1 is, and they say 2, are they right? Yes. Do you know they're right? They could have guessed 2. But if you ask them 1 + 1 and they say 3, you know they don't know, and it gives you a chance to teach them. Right? So then they learn, I was wrong. It's not 3, it's 2. So, yeah, God created us with the ability to learn from our mistakes and to gain knowledge and to gain wisdom so that we can make better choices. And we'll end with this, what's amazing about Solomon is he's 20 years old. He hasn't made any mistakes yet, right? And he's already has this amazing, great wisdom and understanding. There is a next step, but God was pleased with the question that he asked. So that accept is like, I want to highlight that word and see if something comes from it or not.
And rethink that. I want to build a house and learn as you go thing. Because I'm thinking you know the whole thing right there.
You should, but you can do it. I've seen them.
Yeah, and it's not pretty.
Yeah. All right.
I can attest to that. Your husband wants it to be pretty. That's why.
That's right. Perfect. Okay. Well, let's pray and we'll go home. Thank you, Lord, for Solomon's life. Thank you for your word. Thank you for a man that you loved and cared for, and you made him the wisest and most knowledgeable person that ever lived. And we get a chance to read about his life and learn from that, Lord. What an amazing situation. We ask you to bless the word as we study it, that you would gain, as you tell us, to pray for wisdom, Lord, and ask that you would give us wisdom and knowledge about you, and that we would grow in our understanding of who you are as God alone, the creator of heaven and earth and all things. And we thank you that you love us and that through Jesus you have torn down that veil, the barrier that separates us from you, the Holy of Holies, the greatest and only God. And we ask you to do this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Thank you.